How you doing? My name is Chris. I'm going to tell you straight up, right off the bat, this video isn't going to be for everybody. You guys who have been doing woodworking for a while, several years or so, you're probably going to already know the information I'm going to pass on today. So this is not intended for you. This is intended for those of you who may just be getting started in woodworking, or perhaps you're just thinking about making your first project out of wood. And most likely, most woodworkers begin their first projects they ever do, they start working with pine. And there's a lot of things to know about pine. If you're going to do this, I don't want you to have a bad experience. So I'm going to cover some things that you probably got to know about pine before you go spending all the time building your first project with it. There's a lot of different looks, and pine has a lot of different quirks. The many faces of pine, headed your way next. Okay, let's get started by talking about what pine actually is. Pine, in case you don't know it, pine is actually more of a term than it is a direct species. And by that I mean there are a lot of different species of wood sold under the heading of pine. So if you go into your big box store, depending on your area and what's locally grown or what's available to the people that are actually buying it and then reselling it, you could be dealing with anything. There are several different species of wood that fall under the category of pine. For instance, there's ponderosa pine, there's southern yellow pine, there's spruce tree, Douglas fir. I know in parts of the United States, hemlock is sold under the heading of pine. So pine is more of a general term to cover a species of wood that have similar characteristics. Now, within pine, each different species does have its own characteristics, and for this video, I'm not really going to get into trying to identify the wood that you're currently working with, because for the most part, most things that are sold under the heading of pine pretty much have all the same kind of typical characteristics, and the differences are basically in the contrast between the soft and the hardwoods, which may be contained within a board. Some pine boards, such as yellow pine, is a lot harder than some other different variations of pine, but they all have the same sharp contrast within boards between the hardwood and the softwood, just to different varying degrees. So they all act pretty much the same. But pine, just as in any wood, has different looks. There are many different faces to pine. And by that I mean the appearance of pine, especially pine because it's dramatic, will change depending on the way it's cut. And by that I mean the way that the sawyer actually ended up cutting the wood. And if you'll give me a moment, let me zoom the camera in here and I'll give you a quick idea of the different types of species, I mean not species, but the different types of appearances pine can give you and why that may be important to you. And I'll briefly, let's just say you got to build a table. Forget about the top of the table for a second. Let's say you're just building the base. If you're building the base of the table, you may want to have a consistent look with the wood you're using so that nothing looks out of place. And depending on how the wood is sawn, it will change that a lot. You may want to have a very broad grain structure to your base of your table, and so therefore you're going to be looking for a certain kind of wood. And depending on how it's sawn, the appearance does change. So like I said, let me bring the camera in and I'll show you the differences that you will see in pine, and hopefully this will help you choose the wood when you're at the big box store, or if you happen to have a sawyer by you, you'll know what to look for and how to identify it. And if you're looking for consistency in a piece, you'll know exactly what you're looking to buy, and it will help you eliminate wood that you don't want to use because it lacks the consistency of what you want to use. Okay, if you look at these three boards, you'll notice some differences, some a little less and some pretty dramatic. Each one of these boards was sawn in a different fashion, or is basically classified into a different fashion. This one you can see has very broad grain on it. This one, much narrower grain structure and probably a little straighter. And this one is even more consistent between the distance of the hard and soft wood, and it is even straighter than this board. And that's because all wood is sawn in three different fashions, or ends up being classified into three different fashions. And the best way for me to show you how to look at what you are actually buying is to let me pick up these boards, turn them around, and let you take a look at the end grain, and I'll show you how to make sure that if you want consistency in a product, especially with pine, because the grain actually does show in pine very well, then you need to know what you're buying, and you want to be consistent in what you are buying, and it will help eliminate the woods that you don't really want to use. Okay, by looking at the end grain on the board, you'll be able to tell which fashion it was sawn, or which you're currently dealing with. This board here, you'll notice that the grain on the end is running in more of a horizontal direction than this one. This one starts to become relatively vertical, and this one is even more vertical still. And that's because wood is sawn in 3 different fashions. The differences are primarily this. Let me see if I can lay these up here and show you. If you look at these demonstration pieces, you'll see that this has a very horizontal grain direction. This is known as flat sawn wood. This is the piece of wood that had that very broad grain that I was originally talking about when I had these 3 stacked up. This was the middle one, and this was the top one. This is what is known as rift sawn wood, and this is what is known as quarter sawn wood. Here's the distinction. Anything that falls between 0 degrees and 30 degrees is considered flat sawn wood. If the wood is between 30 degrees and 60 degrees, it's known as rift sawn wood. And anything that is between 60 and 90 degrees, grain direction wise, is known as quarter sawn wood. And as I showed you earlier, they each have a different distinctive look. And the reason why I mentioned that to you is because if you are looking for that table-based example I gave earlier, if you're looking for consistency in the grain direction or the appearance of the wood, then the way this wood is sawn becomes relatively important. You may pick up a piece of wood that you look at and go, wow, that's really pretty. All right, well, if that's the wood you've chosen, that's the look you like, take a look at the end grain. Just find out what it is. Is it flat sawn, rift sawn, quarter sawn? And buy the rest of the wood that you believe you're going to need to complete your piece that is either all flat sawn, all rift sawn, or all quarter sawn. Because if you put this next to this in the middle of a project, one of these is going to be out of place. Whichever is the minority in that piece is going to look like it doesn't belong. So that's why consistency may be important. Now, what people like and what people don't like is obviously very much an individual choice. So I'm just suggesting that if you're looking for consistency, then look at the end grain of the wood you're buying and make sure you buy the same type of wood. Flat sawn, rift sawn, or quarter sawn. That will help you get consistency in a project if that's indeed what you're looking for. And those characteristics are true with virtually any type of wood. How it's sawn and the consistency of it in the final piece should be important. Pine is very prevalent because the grain structure really stands out. Other woods do as well, but if you're just starting out in woodworking and you're using pine, that may be a consideration you want to take in hand. That said, if once again you are starting out in woodworking, and let me see if I can relate this. In a recent episode of the podcast, we were talking about tools, and we were talking about how people, most of us, buy cheap and then upgrade as we can afford it. And it was brought up by a listener that that's not an approach that would be recommended. And he made a very good point. The point he was making was if you start out with a really lousy tool, it may spoil or tarnish your interest in that tool, and so therefore you never end up like using it, and it's just something you end up discarding. Instead, he said maybe you should start with a medium or a somewhat quality tool so that you get the actual experience of it and not the crappy experience. And so then, therefore, your judgment of it isn't tarnished. Well, the same can be said for woodworking and wood. If you were just getting started in woodworking, maybe building your first or second project, my advice to you would be don't use pine. Pine is a very difficult wood to deal with in a lot of different areas, and I wouldn't want it to tarnish your view of the craft or your view of your hobby. If you can afford it and the budget will allow, I would suggest you start out using a wood that is pretty much as readily available as pine. It just costs a little bit more, but not all that much more when it comes down to it, and that would be used poplar. Poplar has a lot of characteristics in it that, or it doesn't have characteristics in it, I should say, that pine actually does. It doesn't dent well easily as pine. It stains really well. It actually, if you're going to paint your project, poplar paints a lot better than pine does. And as a woodworker, it's just more of a pleasure to use if you're going to be starting out to use poplar than it is to use pine. And because poplar isn't among the pine family, there's a noticeable characteristic and difference that you'll find in pine and poplar. And that characteristic is normally a lack of knots. I'm not saying that poplar you can't find knots in. You find knots in every wood. But poplar has fewer knots than pine. And there's a problem with pine when it comes to working with it and milling it. And so once again, what I'll end up doing is I'm going to bring the camera in so you can get a close-up on this, but I want to show you some things you should be careful of, because I know I'm not going to change the world here. Most of you are going to start out using pine. But there are some things you should look for before you decide to go running a piece of pine through a table saw or a chop saw or any other kind of saw, because pine can actually hurt you. I'll tell you why in a sec. Okay, let me show you a quick comparison of what I'm talking about. In pine, you're going to find knots obviously very prevalent. And if you look at this knot here, you'll notice that yes, it is cracked, and just FYI, the cracking that goes on within these knots is because this part of the board here dried at a different rate than this part of the board here. And so that tension has to go somewhere, and normally you'll find the crack. In pine, the majority of the time you'll find the crack right there in the pine. But I want you to take a closer look at the surrounding area of the knot. It doesn't look too bad. Honestly, I wouldn't be too concerned about running this through a saw. It's possible some of those pieces of that knot could still come back and hit me, but I know that that knot is in there pretty solid. And I'll tell you how I know it. Let's take a look at this one. You see that very dark circle around that knot? And it's obvious if you look at this, this has obviously got gaps around the knot itself. But even if it didn't have those gaps, if you see a knot in pine and you see this dark circle that surrounds it, that's a loose knot. And if you go running that through a table saw, there's a very good chance this knot is going to come flying out of the board and is going to come back and hit you. And trust me, that hurts. I don't want to tell you exactly how I know that, but I do know that for a fact. If that comes out of there on a table saw and flies back at you, and you're not wearing your ear protection and your proper safety gear, that could hurt you, and that could hurt you bad. Try to avoid, if you can at all, any type of pine board where you see a knot in it like this, if you know you're going to be cutting this board this way, or even this way. I had a pine board, and this is a cutoff from that pine board. You see this? That knot came out, excuse me, where am I? There we go. That knot came out, and I just barely tapped it with a tack hammer, and that knot came out. Now, if I hadn't done that, and if I had left that in place and run that through a table saw, I can guarantee you that would have come back and hit me. Be careful with pine and with knots. And here's something else I want to emphasize to you. If you look at this knot here on this board, remember I told you the characteristics? This knot looks like it's in there and it's nice and firm. But when you're dealing with a 1 inch or 4/4 inch, a 4/4 piece of wood, then you've got to be worried about not only that knot, but what does that knot look like underneath there? And I'll show you. You see that? That is a loose knot. If I was to take this board and cut it this way, there's a good chance that piece right here would come flying out. Investigate the wood before you cut it. Pine is the worst when it comes to this. Most other woods you don't have as prevalent as a problem as you do with pine. So keep an eye on your workpiece and keep yourself safe. Okay, and the last thing I want to touch on today regarding pine is finishing it. And one of the reasons why I recommended poplar over pine if you're just getting started is because you're going to have a lot more luck doing finishing, especially if you're going to be adding a color like a stain or a dye to the wood. Because pine has got to be one of the most difficult woods to work with when it comes to getting a consistent look across the piece of a pine. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. The differences in the hard fibers and the soft fibers of pine is dramatic. And the soft fibers will really soak up a lot of stain or a lot of color, where the dark obviously won't. And it's actually, in some parts of a board, you see, this has a relatively consistent color as it sits right now. But if you take a stain and put it on a raw, untreated piece of pine, you're going to find out that there's going to be a dark spot here, a light light spot here, a little darker spot here, maybe a medium dark spot here, another light spot maybe over here. That's what is known as blotching. And I know a lot of people who really like the look of blotching on pine. And I don't know if that's because they're used to it, or if it's because finishing and what appeals to you, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. If you like that look, you're gonna love pine, because pine will give you blotching like you would not believe. If you're going for a consistent color, however, you really want to treat the wood before you put a stain on it. So look into pre-stain or a pre-color conditioner. I happen to use a pre-color conditioner by a gentleman named Charles Neal that works extremely well on pine. But if you don't want to get that, then at least get a pre-stain conditioner, because what the pre-stain conditioner is expected to do, and what it is intended to do, is to make the soft grain or the soft wood on this board equal the density of the hardwood when it comes to absorption. So therefore, when you put a stain across the face of it, it should absorb equally across the face. And so therefore it gives you a more consistent color and it doesn't distort, which is known as blotching. I still highly recommend that you begin with Poplar, but if you don't, because like I said, I know I'm not going to change the world, and most woodworkers are going to start out using pine because it's cheap and it's available. Just know a few things about it before you do, so you don't ruin your experience at the beginning of your woodworking. It's just that easy. Get out there, use pine if that's what you're going to use. Just know a few things about it, but go make that first cut. Get the project done, and I'll talk to you later. Have a good one.